welcome. Huckster bears, welcome. In blue jam, blue jam, blue jam, blue jam, blue jam.
It started in the park, as I was lying down and my head hit a hard lump in the ground. I needed to lie down because the chemist had made a mistake and I'm used to a slightly milder antidepressant. When I dug the lump out of the ground, I saw that it was metallic with a handle. It looked a bit like an electric drill. There was a lever for your finger to rest against. I felt I ought to know what it was. I knew I had seen lots of them in films. I thought the tobacconist might help. I pulled it out when I was buying half an ounce of Golden Virginia and some blue Rizzlers, but he just flew upset and started shouting. He threw money at me, which felt wrong, and told me to leave with whatever I wanted, as long as I just get out. I took one £10 note and left him to his strained worries. At the bus stop, there was a lady sitting in a way that reminded me of the nurse who used to sit at the front of our class in primary school. She'd know what this thing was. I fished it out and she sort of gasped, fell off the seat sideways, and seemed to be asleep suddenly. I thought I'd better do something. I flagged a passing taxi and pulled the sleeping lady into the back with me. The cabbie looked in his mirror. I pulled out the object and was about to ask him what it was when he said, "I don't want any trouble. Where do you want to go?" The nocturnal mammal house in the zoo was the only place I really wanted to go at that moment. I use it sometimes to collect my thoughts. When we reached the zoo, I thanked the driver and left the lady in the cab with the tenner in her mouth. I didn't want to mess around with her pockets, and it was open. On my way to Netherworld, I could hear police sirens. Passers-by were staring at me more than usual. Behind me, some youths were laughing at a masturbating bonobo which had paused to be sick. I ducked through their gaggle and into an open door in the 8th block. A keeper was tending his Gibbons. Something about my sudden presence in the cage made him run off. Outside, a teacher was telling some children why the gibbon has long arms. Inside, a large gibbon demonstrated by grabbing my object by its nozzle and knocking me about the face. The children screamed. The teacher yelled, "Form a protective crocodile," and dived onto the floor. The gibbon sniffed the instrument, scratched its head, and bang! I remembered what it was. The bullet hit the side of a forlorn elephant, which had been repeatedly throwing its lunch of hay into the air. I think she was too depressed to notice. The gibbon was now excited and shot out through the open door. I stumbled after it, feeling a gloomy sense of danger as it headed towards the Muffin Bear terraces. Through the turmoil, I could see a single Asiatic bear rocking dismally from side to side. The gibbon began firing randomly into its pit. As I launched myself into a smothering dive, I heard a loud crack and one of my thighs burst with pain. I rotated my head to see a tranquilizer dart sticking out of my leg and turned back to find myself missing the startled ape and plummeting into the bear's enclosure. Rolling around in the dust, I began to feel vague. I seemed suddenly hot, so I took my clothes off. The keeper who had fired the darts was shouting words like "no" and "idiot." I found a roll-up. I lit it, took a deep drag, and offered it to the bear. With the cigarette in its mouth, it seemed to look happier. Then I knew I was collapsing, because I do know exactly what that feels like. When I woke up, I was in a strange bed. Most beds are strange to me. An advertising executive I know called Susie was sitting next to me, watching television. It showed a wobbly camcorder view of a naked man offering a cigarette to a shaking bear and then falling over. A studio discussion followed these pictures. One man said we should be more careful with children and animals and the unemployed. He was interrupted by another who said, "Rubbish. This is just another tawdry example of the prank generation." He said the man responsible was probably an American. I felt myself wanting to agree with the first man, but actually agreeing with the second, though I have no idea why. Often at night, I hear a crying sound coming out just below my nose. My eyes are watering. There's a lot of dust in the air. I can't see too well anyway because I pawned my corneas 2 days ago to buy a pair of shoes. The replacements are cheap and ill-fitting, and the anaesthetic wears off quickly, so 15 minutes later I'd spent all the money on a week's supply of codeine. I ate it outside. I had to lie down on the pavement while the painkillers got round to my eyes. I hung my head over the curb to make them arrive faster. Before she ran away, my wife said this would happen. She even got the date right. I tried to remember the expression when she said it. I had just got as far as a large, roaring mouth when a pair of shoes appeared next to my head. I thought they looked familiar. They were familiar because I'd lost them in a bet to the art dealer, Jaffet Corncrake. "That's rather good," he said. "Is this a new performance piece or just a work in progress?" "I sold my eyes," I said. "I can't see." He clapped his hands and jumped up and down, thoroughly impressed. "That's very good. I like it. We must talk about this. Are you very busy this evening? Because I've got a new show on at the gallery if you'd like to come along." I couldn't say no. I couldn't say anything because I didn't want to, and words don't form in my mouth when that happens. So he hailed a taxi and pushed me into it. As we drove through London, he talked fluidly about art. Coincidentally, I felt very sick. And when I asked him whether perhaps he could return my shoes, he said, "You really will make an excellent installation. Who writes your scripts?" Corncrake's private gallery was full of people. It was also full of water, as it was really a swimming pool with pictures hung along the walls. The guests were swimming round and chattering. Corncrake introduced me to a hugely fitted woman called Hymenoptera, who helped me into the pool and gave me a drink. A man named Howard's Knack touched me on the nipple and asked me what I thought about the Sarajevo school. I was about to say, "Please help me," when Helen Collop swam up, popped a cherry in my mouth, kissed my forehead, and asked me how my mother was, and then swam away again without waiting for an answer. Hymenoptera surfaced with a tray of crudités and shot me a greasy wink. It was at this point that the level of codeine in my blood became critical, and the contents of my stomach flew out of my mouth in a surprising yellow jet, which, as my head sank below the surface, acted much like a turbine, propelling me 10 feet backwards through the water. The last thing I heard was Hymenoptera asking timidly, "Was that supposed to happen?" I'd like to hear some music now. Preferably the Bucharest Symphony Orchestra in chorus performing Ligatti's Requiem, which should be played on a cassette machine with flat batteries. Start the tape now, please. Thanks. Ligatti's incorporation of polyrhythms contrives to produce one of the most crystalline and difficult pieces of music ever written. No piece of music ever summed up death better. No human being ever experienced anything close to death while still being alive. Edward Heath attended the British premiere and asked the conductor if he had the right music in front of him. That was before inflation, and the 3-day week, and candles. Any minute now, the blowflies will hatch. They've been breeding in a scrap of kidney next to my foot. I cannot bend down or move from side to side in here, and I must remain standing with my face pressed to the thick glass. Still, I am lucky. When Susie found me, I had been stranded on a traffic island for 4 hours, and when she suggested that she take me home to have me walled up as an art installation, I agreed straight away. So here I am, in an alcove in her living room, being exhibited behind glass next to a plaque bearing the name Berens Oslo. Berens Oslo is the artist that did me. There is a copper tube to help me breathe, and I am naked except for a string vest. Some of my lower parts have been painted yellow. I think the cleaning lady pushed the kidney through the tube, but it missed my mouth and fell to my feet. Susie is having a sort of dinner to open me officially. It seems to be a great success. Her face is all blotchy with anticipation as she waits for guests to react to me. I am a great hit when one of them taps on the glass and says, "Susie, you are a genius. This is what art should be like, moving in a relevant way." I have instructions to reply to these comments by saying, "I am very sorry, this art is crap." Of course, the guest is flabbergasted because they have no idea I can hear them. Only very recent Berens Oslo has come fitted with a ticket machine intercom. They start raving about the magnificence of a piece of art that is capable of criticising itself. "That's amazing," they say. "This art is capable of criticising itself." As I continue to slag myself off, there is a buzz of expectation as Will Self arrives with his special pillow and miniature chicken. He spots me and immediately delivers himself of the opinion that he has never seen a more klepto-masturbatory anthropoid. He kneels and says that now he has glimpsed all of our hypocrisies in a neuroplastic ellipse. There follows a period of silent eating, with occasional sobs and the passing and gradual filling of a tear thimble. I've been here for a couple of hours now. Susie summons the guests into an adjoining room. She is an excellent hostess. One girl stays behind because she's trying to chase the dragon and it keeps getting away. In the adjoining room there is a hatch which allows access to my back parts. Susie opens it up, and guests take it in turns to put their hands through. I gather from their language that they are attempting to read my arse. There's a kind of binary braille encoded into the relative temperatures of my buttocks. Extra verbs are in the roughness and adjectives in the formation of folds around my daisy. Presently I can hear squabbling. Apparently my arse has declared that one of them is the slave master, but hasn't revealed which one it is. I am beginning to feel ill. There is no one to notice me except the girl with the foil. She sees that I am in distress and walks slowly up to me with a very unintelligent look on her face. She empties a lungful of dragon onto my tube. My next action is caused by the combination of poppy smoke and the new development taking place next door, which some of the guests are calling Feed the Arse. A high-pressure jet of old stomach emerges from my tube, just as Will Self is passing on his way home. "We are all Huxley's Babkins," he says, and vaults through a closed window. The truth is that events continued in pretty much the same way for about a week. I think the girl who had shown herself clumsy with the horse may have died. The blowflies certainly did hatch and blocked my view completely, so that my abiding memory is the sounds heard through buzzing, mainly the rhythmical slamming of bare skin on alabaster as Susie succumbed with grunts to the meaty pleasure of each new slave master. I was eventually extracted by 6 men in contamination suits. They were extremely distressed. This happened 2 days after Susie went on holiday. I was trying to warm my hand in a discarded bat when the police picked me up and took me to the station for an identity parade. They said a local travel agent had been steamed by a naked old man. I was needed to make up the numbers. "I'm not an old man," I said. "We don't believe you." A short while later, I was standing in the nude between a very old woman and an energetic old man with a homemade Prince Albert. "They'll never identify me with this on," he said, indicating his hastily pierced penis. They didn't. We left the station together. I was in some discomfort as my clothes didn't seem to fit anymore. I could hear the old woman from the parade shouting after me, so I hurried on because it felt like school. "Nice work," said the old man, whose name was Gerard, what she got in her pockets. He was very chuffed. He jangled his chain and farted incomprehensibly. In one of her pockets was a tube of old woman's cream. It smelled of marzipan, but tasted better. Half an hour later, I was sitting on a traffic island squeezing the cream out. I had been aiming for the pub with Gerard, but I couldn't keep up, and he said he couldn't walk any slower, and by the time I got to the pub I had forgotten which one it was. I was annoyed with the tube of cream because it contained air pockets. I slapped its middle and produced several large splats. One of them landed on a nearby shoe. It was somewhat too narrow, in patent leather, with little silver guitars on the ends of the laces. I looked up the shoe, past lemon and chocolate socks and iron jeans to a blue leisure jacket, out of which poked the smiling necklace head of Grayling Barraclough. I had known him on and off for 20 years. We were at school together. I had set him on fire once behind the gym. If he was disappointed by my appearance, he didn't hide it. "Hidey-doody," he said. He was a television director now. He was filming some close-ups of the road with his crew. "I'm filming some close-ups of the road," he said, "for stylistic reasons." I left a short gap and told him about the identity parade. "Hey," he said, and his mouth leaked slightly. "I'm about to do a reconstruction of that very crime." He pointed to the travel agents across the road. 2 extras were hovering around the corner in dressing gowns. I told him that only one man had robbed the shop. I like facts. "Not anymore," he said, and added, "You burked up little ape." I assumed he was right in some way. "Sorry," he said, rubbing his nose vigorously. "I'm jamming on crusty white." Then he said, "Now hear me right out," and explained that this was a new departure in crime reconstruction. "The victims don't know we're coming," he jabbered. "We've got 3 cameras hidden there, there, and there." His neck swelled with pride as he announced that these were 3 of the most brilliant camera angles in the history of crime reconstruction television. He must enjoy shitting himself, I thought. He hurried off to a secret position in a building opposite the travel agents. A few moments later, the 2 extras ran naked round the corner into the shop. There was a sound of muffled gunfire from inside. I was fairly certain the extras weren't carrying guns. I played with my cream. 2 minutes later, a police car sped by, with the wretched face of Grayling Barraclough pressed to the window, looking as though the world had gotten a lot bigger and rougher than when I last saw him. 8 months later, I read on a piece of newspaper I was eating that Grayling had gone to Hollywood and had been fatally injured in some sort of sex accident. I had been in the pub 3 hours, talking to a guy I used to work with called Ian, before I realised he wasn't Ian after all, and I was in the wrong pub. By that stage he was very cross. He poked me in the chest and asked me if I was some sort of puppy squeezer. I didn't know what he meant. He had me thrown out for it. I walked the street until I came to a doorway where I used to lean when I was married to a wife. I think I've forgotten her name now. No, I haven't. It was Rosalind. Yes, I have. I had intended to empty the pub out of my bladder here, but the doorway was lit up and surrounded by film cameras. Hydraulic pistons poked out the side of the building. A beautiful girl sat where I used to lean, holding a bunch of leaves to her face and inhaling deeply, while an assistant applied makeup to her nose and teeth. Next to her, an elephant was being made up too. It wore a special jacket with fireworks attached. Grey foundation was being applied to its trunk. The model was asking if the elephant had been given its breakfast. She said it shouldn't be expected to do this work without eating homeopathically fireproofing seeds. She'd insisted on it in her contract. She got up, put her arms around its trunk and said, "Let there be peace among mammoths." Some models use cigarettes. Some use heroin. My bladder was conker hard and big as a saucepan. A girl came up and asked me if I was with the elephant. I looked at the elephant and I looked at her and wished she was a lavatory. She handed me a script. It said, "Location shoot, the Eden Current account." Behind me, a man started bawling into his hand. It crackled with sounds of obedience. He was the director. After 10 minutes, he was ready for someone to tell his assistant to say action, and the model became immediately concerned about the cameras and asked if they were meat-free. The director slowly explained that this was a spiritualized camera, in which the lenses were made of glass, not meat. I think she felt better. The cameras rolled again. The model started chewing the leaves and smoke poured from the doorway behind her. In the script it said, "Ignite elephant." A man lit the elephant and it walked forwards with fireworks going off on its back. As it passed the model, a squib shot off and it landed in her intricate cinnamon hat. The script made no mention of this. Aromatic flames sprouted in the bark. Some of the crew wanted to stop filming. Others wanted to tell her to look out, as she was still lost to her leaves. A skirmish between horror and fascination broke out on the director's face. With a sudden pang of decision, he ordered half the cameras to stop and the other half to keep rolling and screamed, "Somebody help the bitch," but not yet. At the same time leaping up and down and slamming himself in the balls. The model realised she was on fire. She scrambled to her feet, tripped and dived under the elephant where she thrashed around magnificently. The stupefied animal urinated like a burst lorry and put her head out. The elephant was still on fire. The model looked at me from the middle of her steaming lake. Something in her eyes spoke to my bladder. Suddenly, I too was pissing like a king all over the elephant's flaming back and ears. I continued to empty for a full 2 minutes after the fires had gone out. As they wheeled the model to the ambulance, one of her assistants called me over. "This is the man who put out the elephant," they said. She pulled a strand of damp hair from her eyes. "Thanks to you, I'm going to give all this up," she said. I nodded. "I'm going to dedicate my life to abused elephants. Maybe, when I save them, they will teach things to men like Sarah taught you about putting out fire with the natural aquas of belly." I wanted to tell her how gaudy she was, even when moist and smelling of damp compost. "You stink of piss and you're thick as shitty jam," I said. As I left, I found a man sitting on the ground with his head in his hands. "You're sad," I said, indicating his face. He pointed to a mass of hydraulics. It was supposed to make the building smile with my pistons. The Eden account makes buildings smile. As he scrunched disconsolately at the gravel, I stood on one of his hands. I had spent the night outside the door of the London dungeon, in case I woke up and forgot I was supposed to be there in the morning. It was my first job in 10 months. It was too cold to sleep, so I passed the hours clinging to a bollard. I thought it might be warm because of its internal bulb. An early morning rollerblader had just piled into my back because all the bollard's light was going up my coat. I crawled to where she lay twitching and stuffed my hands up her shirt. "What are you doing?" she gasped. Something in her tone told me that warming up my hands was not a good enough reason. "Looking for biscuits," I said. I did warm up slightly as she kicked me around the dawn. Some hours later, 2 actors arrived. They were friends of Susie, who had wangled me this job. I couldn't remember if I'd met them before, but they jammed a cigarette in my mouth. As they led me to the dungeon, they both introduced themselves as Paul, then started arguing about whether it was better to be workshopping with Polyukov or trapped in a burning car. They asked me what I'd been doing. "Directing traffic," I said. I thought rather wryly. "Great flyers," said the first Paul, and offered the opinion that though Traffic was a mediocre play, it had been well promoted. In the dungeon there was an office where a manager was sitting. He looked at me and said, "Who are you?" "Paychecks," I mumbled. I used to remember my name by looking at my paychecks. "Ah, you must be that friend of Susie's. May I suggest that the best role for our supporting artist would be the victim?" piped Paul. "Good idea," said the manager. "Show him what to do." Paul and Paul took me to a dirty small room. They told me to strip and gave me a damp, blood-stained loincloth as they changed into their leathery outfits and limbered up, cracking their knuckles and swinging their arms around. "By the way," said Paul, "you're a Jesuit." "Am I?" I asked. "Yes. I'm pretty sure I'm not a Jesuit," but Paul continued. "You're called Anthony. You were tortured to death in 1563 for being a Jesuit and beating the Queen's champion at real tennis. Is this a game?" I said. In a dark, stone-walled room, they told me to lie on a large wooden table. They bound my hands and feet with ropes that ran on capstans at either end. I felt reasonably comfortable and considered a doze when a large group of people trooped in and the Pauls suddenly turned nasty. They snarled and cursed and started cranking the ropes and shouting at me for being a Catholic and plotting treason against the crown. I had no idea I'd done any of these things. "Confess, you Romish pumpkin." They seemed very angry. "It was cold," I stammered, but up her shirt it was warm. Some of the visitors laughed. Paul shouted, "See how the Corribond does most gibberously protest," and applied a pair of Elizabethan pliers to my groin. "Name your co-conspirators, divoshed papal wart." At the end of the first session, there was a ripple of applause, and the Pauls went for a smoke. "Why did you shout at me?" I said. "Trying to upstage people is not clever," said one. "Luckily, it wasn't at all amusing, and I contained you," said the other. "Can I get off now?" I wondered, but they were too busy shaking their heads and tutting the word "burk off." When they came back, a larger crowd had gathered. The screaming and cranking started again, and I began to feel faint. They threatened to cut open my belly, unwind my entrails, and stuff them in my face unless I purged my filthy soul. As I thrashed and blubbed, I noticed a little girl in the audience, gaping in innocent fascination. A dam broke quietly in my belly. Suddenly, words were flying from my mouth. "Stop the pain, I'll tell you everything," I shouted, remembering the time I had taken a Polaroid of my cock and put it in the maths teacher's briefcase, causing him to be fired and then severely mauled whilst on remand in Brixton Prison. I confessed again that I had wandered into a child's park under the influence of Prozac and beaten up an ostrich, while several toddlers looked on and cried. "Please forgive me, for I know not what I do," I heard myself splutter, before finally describing how I had once broken into a farm and tarred and feathered a pig. The Pauls stopped. The audience stared. I begged the little girl to kill me. She left with her mother shortly afterwards. The other people went away. The manager wasn't pleased. He sent me off with a note for Susie pinned to my jacket. "Don't ever send me rubbish like this again," it said. As I left the building, I looked at the river. The Pauls told me I was the worst disaster since Stephen Fry. When the winter comes, I spend a lot of time sitting in reception areas. It's a good way to keep warm. And if you go into a large office building and ask for Mr. Harris in accounts, you can often wait for up to an hour before anyone realises there is no Mr. Harris in accounts. The seats are always soft, and sometimes leathery. There are papers and magazines to read. Some companies have coffee machines and fruit. I have a friend called Martin Chope who lets me sleep in the lobby of the World Service. He works all night because people in the Pitcairn Islands have to hear the news. I haven't actually seen my friend since 1983, but we have an arrangement whereby he calls down to reception every hour or so and asks them to tell me he's a bit busy and he'll be down in a minute. I was drowsing at the World Service one evening when a taxi driver came in and shouted, 13 Addison Gardens, West 12. He looked at me because I was the only one there. I didn't want to disappoint him, so I followed him into the taxi. I thought there might be something to eat there. There was a party going on at 13 Addison Gardens, West 12. I walked in to find a long hallway which had been entirely decorated in AstroTurf. It was like walking through a tubular field. At the end, there was a large room with lots of monitors, showing a porno version of the Teletubbies. A lot of media people were standing around, rubbing their noses and talking very fast. And in the centre of this gaggle was a comedy actor I had read about in a waiting room magazine. He was called Tony. He was standing next to a huge ice sculpture of his head. I was still hungry, so I was stuffing my pockets with crab tartlets when Tony the star banged into me. His eyes were bulging with drugs and self-confidence. "You," he said, "weren't you in show 6? I couldn't answer because I didn't know what he was talking about, so I carried on filling my pockets. "Yeah," said Tony. "You are fantastic, and I want to celebrate your performance with a blowjob. You," he shouted to another actress. "Get over here and suck my cock." An actress approached him slowly, unsure whether this was a good career move. But Tony had produced a rubber vagina and was waving it about, shouting, "I don't need you anyway, you filthy whore." Tony looked at me and asked why I wasn't laughing. I still don't know what to say, so I put another crab tartlet in my mouth and put in another, just in case. He looked like he was going to kill me. Then, suddenly, he threw his arm around my shoulders and whispered, "It's because you see, isn't it? You can see everything." I swallowed a pulpy mass of crab. "I love this guy," he shouted. Then he took me round the room, introducing me to television executives and producers. By the time I got back to the crab tartlets, I had an agent, a transmittable pilot, a 5-year development deal, and someone with a mobile phone said that Jarvis Cocker wanted to meet me. When Tony asked me in a strangely confidential way for my belt, I gave it to him, and he disappeared. My pockets were full of crab, and my trousers started to slip and sag towards my knees. A man from Channel 4 came up to me and said, "If you think you're really going to get a series out of this, you've got another thing coming." "Thank you," I said, and went to look for my belt. The basement was full of people using the drug cocaine. One man seemed to be trying to introduce it to the end of his penis. Another was having his skull trepanned with a Black & Decker drill in order to get the powder straight to his brain. I went up 2 flights. At the top of the house, I heard a muffled humming and running water. I carefully pushed open a door and found Tony standing tiptoe on the edge of a bath. The room was lit by candles, and The Prodigy was playing on a mini-disc. Tony was naked, except for 2 hairdryers taped to his thighs, blowing hot air towards his balls, and he was hanging from the shower rail with my belt around his neck. His hand was holding onto the belt to stop him choking completely, while the right was guiding the path of the rubber vagina. "Sorry," I said. Tony lost his balance and plunged into the water. The hairdryers sparked and fizzled, and the lights blew. Tony flapped and twitched on the end of the belt, and seemed to be trying to say something. I asked if I could have my belt back, but I couldn't tell if any of the sounds he made was yes or no. I closed the door and left a note saying, "Please can I have my belt back when you've finished with it? Care of Martin Chope, BBC World Service, bush house and groped my way downstairs in the dark. The party looked like it was over, but no one could see what they were doing. So I left and sat on a nearby bench where I offered a tramp a crab tartlet. "I've got a transmittable pilot," I said. "Serves you right, you fucking puff," he replied. I never got my belt back, but a week later I saw a picture of it on the cover of a magazine. Susie and a thin man found me in the park. I was walking slowly around the pond, making the bones in my nose tickle by hooting. Susie said that my mother had tipped her off after hearing my voice whilst throwing stones at the ducks. I'd been there a day and a half. "It's because of my job," I explained. "Batch testing new age CDs. "But Hal said he didn't hire you in the end," she said. "That would explain why he hasn't paid me." The thin man with Susie coughed up a small laugh and spat it onto the ground. "You'd better come to dinner on Saturday," Susie said. "Clive will be there too." She squeezed the man's arm. Clive is the suicide journalist. He was ghostly pale with black hair and a sad wit in his eyes. I'd say he looked like John Cusack, if I could remember who the hell John Cusack was. As he gazed moodily at the pond, Susie explained that Clive had announced in his weekly column that he had 6 months to live. On April the 15th, he would be committing suicide, and until then he would write about how it felt to be staring death in the face. Clive took out a notebook and muttered something about the blackness of a moorhen. "Do you know what month it is now?" she asked. I thought it might be Martober. Susie dabbed a damp eye and said that the suicide column was the saddest, funniest, most tragic and uplifting thing she'd ever read. He has 12 weeks to go. I looked across the pond and started honking again. Susie turned to collect Clive, who was puffing on 3 cigarettes and smirking at his notes. "8 or late with a good excuse," she crooned, and popped a sweet in my mouth. I arrived well after dark. A smart woman opened the door. "I couldn't afford a bottle of wine," I said, "so I've drawn one on a piece of cardboard." I had prepared for the party by eating half a jar of instant coffee I'd found in the bins at Sainsbury's. She took my cardboard and said, "That's brilliant, could I use you in a programme?" When I asked her what sort of programme, she said, "I could make a whole series about the things people bring to parties." "What do you do?" I said, thinking of the window at Dixon's. "My name's Hosanna Bell. I work in the warm arts." We stepped past Susie's yachting gear and into the dining room. 7 people sat noisily around the large bowl of oysters, but Susie wasn't a single one of them. I thought I was at the wrong party until they explained that the whole point was to be late, but with a good excuse. "Why are you late?" they asked. I said I'd had no money for a bottle of wine, and the homeless bloke at the tube station who normally subs me a couple of quid because he says I look worse off than his dog was being mugged when I asked him this time and hadn't given me a penny. And then I'd got lost whether Susie's house was directly opposite some trees or directly opposite no trees at all. Several conversations had started by the time I got to that bit. Susie arrived to great squeals and kisses. She announced that she had spent the last 3 hours in bestial congress with a junior cabinet minister. Gobs hung open because everybody had thought he was gay, and several of them also knew that he was her half-brother. She wore a grin as big as a harbour. "Do you think Clive is still coming?" said a sincere man in glasses, and talk turned at once to his column. Hosanna Bell said she had seen more truth in Clive's writing than the entire works of any writer she could think of. A woman called Emma agreed. "I'm still reeling. I don't know whether to weep, laugh, throw up or hug everybody." "That's just your protein rush," observed a man called Paddy, pointing to the 17 shells on her plate. Emma touched his leg. Paddy was Clive's editor, and he was busy milking the table while mildly deprecating the praise for Clive's column, so people doubled it in protest. He was just declaring that the columns would have to be polished up for the book when swearing in the hall announced the arrival of Clive. He looked a bit drunk and seemed small with his coat off. He said he was sorry he was late, but actually he didn't give a fuck. Everybody laughed, except Paddy. Susie said, "This brilliant man has asked me if you'd all take it easy on the suicide questions tonight," and helped him liberally to buy valves. We nodded, of course, and I asked him if he thought oysters could commit suicide. Susie glared at me.
I said I was just wondering if an oyster could make a decision like that.
And if so, how would it die, because it couldn't really hang itself? "Are you being weird or sarcastic?" said Emma. "I don't know, because I get the two feelings mixed up." She called me a plankton and started telling Clive about the time she had cut her wrists. "Look at my scars," she said. "They are beautiful, but not as beautiful as your columns." For some reason, Clive looked at me as he said, "Only the very ugly is truly beautiful, and if the printed word has any meaning, then it must come from the very edge of fucky bum boo-boo." There were titters. Paddy muttered something about Clive alienating his fans, but was cut off by Emma. "No, Clive has every right to be drunk. You are in masses of pain, Clive. You are doing it for us." "Yes," agreed Hosanna. Clive asked her what the hell she knew. "In the warm arts, we're strong on people power," she said. "And what you have done in volunteering to take your own life is illuminate the poignant resonance, the self-destructor in all of us." There was a ripple of applause. Clive, who had been sousing his oysters in vodka and setting them alight before hurling them down his throat, now added a cigarette to the turmoil and belched the word bollocks. Paddy banged the table and started telling Clive that if all he could do was get pissed and shove drugs up his bum for the last 12 columns, he would lose all his priceless empathy. "This is the finest copy I've ever commissioned," he said, "and I'm not having it ruined by some jumped-up little floozy going gold diddums." A man called Stitt said that Paddy was threatening the purity of Clive's columns. "If he uses the bottle, that should come through in his work. But he'll end up writing about you lot," said Paddy. Suddenly, all the guests were telling Clive about the time they'd nearly topped themselves. Hosanna Bell described how she'd been suicidal for 6 months after giving birth, until she'd decided to sue her baby for what it had done to her figure. Clive was insulting everyone and writing notes on his cuffs. "Losers! Crap attempt!" he shouted. "I want something that actually works." Someone said hosepipes work. Clive knew a bloke in a garden centre in Maidstone who actually cuts them to length for your particular car. He said the people carrier length hose was the most popular. "Wow," said Hosanna Bell, now also scribbling feverishly. "So then, Mr. Superstar," Paddy was saying, "what is the best way to kill yourself?" Clive said that in fact the best way he knew was to buy 200 foot of nylon rope, tie one end around your neck and the other round a lamppost and get in your car and floor the accelerator. He said that's how his uncle had done it. He'd made Clive help him. He was just 9 years old, and he'd had to ride in the car and stop it crashing when his uncle's head came off. The blood had made the pedals very slippy. Clive blinked, smarting eyes. The table fell silent. "Really?" said Paddy, genuinely shocked. "Of course not, you moron," brayed Clive, and went on to explain that we were all idiots and he could say anything and we'd lap it up just because we thought his pain meant something. How we wouldn't give him a second thought if he wasn't going to kill himself, except he wasn't actually anyway because the whole thing was a hoax and he was going to say so in his column next week. Paddy erupted and decked Clive with the oyster bowl. Then he stood over him, roaring that this was his fucking idea. Clive had agreed to do it, and he wasn't going to wriggle out of killing himself now. Not now there was a book. Clive crawled from the room. The general opinion was that Clive had just treated us to his most savage and moving cry for help yet. We had all underestimated his pain. "I feel choked up now," said Emma, "but if I read about it next week, I'll be crying for the rest of the year." Someone bring me a fucking fag. Clive's voice sounded glutinous. Susie gestured to me as everyone else was still debating the meaning of his actions. He lay on the floor, 2 regurgitated oysters a tongue's length from his leaking mouth. One of them still slightly alive. His nose seemed a better place for the cigarette. The caustic fumes revived him, and he stumbled to his feet. "I'm going out," he said. "I'm going to break into a car and then drive around drunk until I crash." As he lunged past me into the hall, his foot snagged on a rope among Susie's boat bags, and he fell onto the seagrass. We both looked at a large coil of blue nylon. "Are you good at knots?" he said. Susie's car keys were hanging by the front door. "You might as well use the Discovery," I said. "She'll be so thrilled to have a new story." About an hour later, I revealed that Clive hadn't just gone for a walk. He'd gone to divorce his head and how I'd helped him with the keys and the knots. I needed to go to sleep, and had correctly anticipated that Paddy would punch my lights out.
Rothko woofed. He was sitting in the armchair again. He occasionally looked at the telly. Mostly, he was looking at me looking at the telly. Rothko didn't want me there in Imogen's house that I was supposed to be looking after. I looked at him now. A big, Irish wolfhound with deep, dark eyes. In one, I could see Imogen telling me to take him for walks, but not to let him off the lead as he hadn't been squirrel trained. And in the other, I saw me, saying, "Yes, and don't lose the keys like you did last time, you worthless little prick. God, your mother hates you." My brother was over my shoulder for that bit. I double-locked the front door and looked at the keys. "What shall we do with these?" I said to Rothko. He looked quizzical. "Probably better to leave them safe in there, isn't it?" I said, and posted them back through the door. "Now don't lose the dog." I made a noose with the handle of the lead and looped it around my neck. I had to stoop slightly, but I figured the knob of my head would stop us ever becoming separated. So we clattered to the park, Rothko galloping ahead, me stumbling behind like a bear running too fast down a hill. 20 yards into the park, Rothko glimpsed the duck pond and bolted. I landed in the shallows as Rothko closed his jaws on the nearest mallard. He shook his head violently so its quacks were broken like the honks of a goose in a cement mixer. A little girl was crying, "Help the ducky." I dripped stupidly. The girl's dad grabbed the duck and slapped at the dog's nose, whimpering, "Stop it," and "This is appalling." He was clearly the sort of sensitive man that Rothko had no respect for. They separated with a splash, and so did the duck. The man stared dumbly at the legs in his hand, and suddenly everyone was screaming RSPCA at me. The lead snapped tight around my neck as Rothko dodged a blow, and the world became purple and banging. Through the rumble, I could hear my own strangled peanut of a voice screaming, "No, please, it's the dog, and it's not mine, it's Imogen Edwards's." Rothko turned to me with curled lips.
"Imogen's not going to be happy with you at all,"
he said. Before I had time to gulp, he flew past me towards the park gate.
"Leg it, you fat fuck,"
he screamed. I followed in an anoxic blaze. People were running after us. A bus was pulling off 20 yards from the gate. I overtook the dog and launched us into the old lady's plea section. He leapt onto the seat beside me.
"What the fuck is this?"
he said.
"I only go in taxis. You can't expect me to look after your legal case in these conditions."
"Legal case?" I said. He eyed me directly.
"Just think about all the things you've been doing wrong. Someone's got to defend them."
A tiny, electric cube of panic. I began to recall a time when I was 7 and a gerbil had started swearing at me. Amongst other things, it had told me that my dad was having an affair. I had told my mum, and soon afterwards, the family had split up. "Are you the gerbil?" I said.
"Now you're losing it,"
he replied. "Yes," said the conductor. I had no money.
"Ask him if we can pay on account,"
said Rothko. "Can we pay on account?" I said. The conductor eyed me suspiciously. Pay your fare now or get off.
Tell him you'll only pay if he can prove you will definitely get to the next stop,
suggested the dog. I did. The conductor looked at me as if his mother had just walked out of my nose.
Tell him I'm a lawyer,
the dog said. I knew I shouldn't, but I did that too. At the next stop, we were shown the pavement. I looked at Rothko. Why are you talking? I said. Dogs don't talk.
So why are you asking me?
He replied. Don't try to be clever, I said.
No, I am being clever.
Well, this is ridiculous, I said, because you're only a dog.
Well, if I am only a dog, then you should be able to answer my questions easily.
I know about panic attacks. I know I have to find something very mundane and ordinary to do to talk myself down.
Have some tea,
said the dog. I know that, I said. The cafe was full of people smoking and eating bacon and eggs. The dog sat down next to me. He turned to me and said, I
want a full English breakfast.
Stop freaking me out, I muttered, his lip curled with disdain.
Get me some fucking breakfast, pickle pants.
Then a new voice. Get that dog off my seat. The cafe lady was angry.
Tell that fat cow I sit in a seat every day of my life and I'm not shifting now,
said the dog. Are you going to get him off? Asked the woman more angrily. I'm very sorry, I said. He says he's my lawyer, but I'm still not sure. However, I don't want to risk throwing my lawyer onto the floor, bearing in mind the number of things I've done wrong. She glowered. I felt a situation happening, but I didn't know where it was coming from. Are you angry with me because he just called you a fat cow? I said. In the street, Rothko called me a hapless tit. He told me he had an empty stomach and was now unlikely to get a single detail of my case correct. I said I didn't care, because since I'd known he was my lawyer, things had only got worse. Our bickering turned to swearing as we levelled with the church gate. A family was getting out of a car. Rothko cheered up when he saw this.
That little girl's got a snotty hanky in her pocket,
he said, and tugged me towards her. Why couldn't I control anything? The little girl squeaked with delight as Rothko stuck his nose in her pocket. The mother patted him on the head and asked me how old he was. The dog said he was 5. He says he's 5, but in fact he's 7, I said. The mother looked at me and decided I was joking. Rothko rooted for the hanky, but the pocket was small. Sorry about him, I said. He's not a very good dog, but he's an even worse lawyer. The father smiled politely and urged them towards the church. Leave them now, I said. The little girl turned back. Rothko made to follow. Look, if you don't stop this now, you're fired, I shouted. The family were looking at me now. I knew it was bad for people to see me threatening to sack a dog, so I repeated myself, but this time in dog language. The father shook his head sadly and whisked his family inside. It was a christening. The tissue girl and her parents had joined the others around the font. A priest was holding a baby over the water, and the baby was shrieking like ripping metal.
Well, I can do that,
said Rothko, and began to howl idiotically. Shh, I said, and tried to hide it with a cough. Is there a problem back there? Asked the priest, a fat drumming now in my skull cheeks. You're ruining this christening, I said.
It's not me, it's you, said the dog.
What?
Well, I only came in here so you could seek forgiveness from God.
What for?
For what you're about to do,
said the dog, and looked me straight in the eye. I felt as sick as diesel. Is something wrong? Said the priest.
Say there is,
said the dog. There is, I mumbled. All eyes turned on me. What? Hot iron in my nose.
Look at the baby,
said the dog. I looked at the baby. Its head swiveled towards me. Then it screamed, Tell them my mother is a whore and the priest fiddles with children. Oh, now look what you've done, I said to the dog.
I've seen his notes, said the dog. It's true, you must tell them.
What's the problem? Said the priest. Ball lightning in my stomach, the baby still staring at me. Go on. You rummage the kid's pants and she receives the cocks of paying men. The priest's mouth fell open. The baby said, Sucker. Its father started towards me. The baby told me, I stammered. Rothko lurched towards the little girl, who was waving her tissue. The baby's father grabbed me by the neck. The dog leapt. The girl's mother plucked her from the floor, and the dog clattered into the priest, knocking the baby from his hands. The baby's mother screamed. The father released my neck and spun towards his wife. I looked at the dog.
You're doing all this?
He laughed and grabbed the tissue from the girl's hand. The baby was still in the air. I looked at the dog again. What the fuck do I do now?
Well, don't ask me, I'm only a dog,
said the dog, and pelted down the nave, through the porch, down the path, and straight into the road, where he slapped straight into a van, staggered around, and fell over. Manic birdsong. I dropped to my knees in the road. Blood oozed from his mouth.
Well, I can't defend you now, you know,
he said. Sparrows singing the Dies Irae. Could you recommend someone? I asked.
Try the baby.
Really?
Oh yes,
he said, and smiled. Then he went quite quiet and still. I managed to crawl back to Imogen's house. The baby had not been much use, but its father had given some advice to the soft tissues in my face and groin. I lay outside her front door and wondered what to do. The best thing would be to write a note, I said to myself. I'll write a note and explain everything. My note said,
Thanks for Imogen? Sorry about the dog. The duck was in bits. The thing's talking as well, but told me not to say. But I followed it. The car did it. The keys are in the wrong half. I went away. It's alright, please.
I know that's what I wrote because I just found the note in my pocket. Here's another. This one's to me. It's from the dead dog. It's a very angry note. Here's one from the dog's mother now. She's even crosser. I don't go to the park now. The ducks tell everyone things about me. They tell everyone I thought a dog could talk. Shut up, I said when they did, but they didn't. And I hate them now. The ducks. I had been in town for 4 days, on a roof. I hadn't meant to be there that long. I had just gone up to check a pigeon trap that I'd set up last year, and had been cornered by a paper sack which kept blowing at me in a scary way. The roof was near the office of Stephen Vone. He edits a pull-out section. I thought he might lend me the money to get home. Hey Buzz, looking shit, said Vone. He always calls me by the wrong name. He said he needed a piece on street sausage vendors and offered me 200 quid if I sampled 30 sausages and filed by Friday. The angle was, we don't know which ones make you sick. Susie said that £200 was very low for 2,000 words. Not as low as £20, I said, which is what you paid me for being sick in that documentary. By 3 o'clock the next afternoon, I had drawn a sausage. 2 days passed in a very similar fashion. I told Susie I must be a writer because I had writer's block. She said that this was balls and told me to get out and eat some sausages. It's Thursday now, so you'll have to eat them all today. By 10 a.m. I had scoffed 14. The more I ate, the less I felt like walking. So the last 6 had come from the same wagon. The vendor kept peering at me as I sat and wrote. When I went to buy number 15, he said, I'm telling Turkish Bob about you. He don't like people getting nosy on his meat. 16 sausages later, I'd had an extra one to impress Vone. I was prodding at a shop demo laptop in Dixon's. I detailed my test method feeling bloated and toxic. The nausea thickened, and I realised that I had no way of telling which sausage was responsible for what level of sickness. May I ask what you're doing? It was a woman's voice.
"Do I know you?" I said. "Not exactly," she laughed, "but you are no doubt experiencing that strange frisson of talking to somebody who seems familiar because you know them so well from their photos. Isn't it a weird feeling?" "What photos?" "Oh, come on, look," and rested her chin on the back of her hand, glanced to the left and sucked in her cheeks. "What's that?" I said. "Oh, honestly, why do you think that everyone is looking at me? Maybe because you're making quite a noise." My "s" was cut off by the beck of her because I'm Ruby Fuss. I write on a Friday, and I couldn't help noticing that you are writing a story on that computer. I started to explain. "Hang on," she said, and dug a tape recorder out of her bag. "I haven't had a decent story since Bolan died." She told me Bolan was her terminally ill dog, and that she'd charted its death every week for 4 months, and that all of London was weeping. God, it's been pants getting stuff for the column. "I was going to have to get myself drug raped this week," she said, brandishing a jar of tablets. She gave me one and started asking questions. No one has been that interested in me since school when I nailed my hand to my head. We talked of salty meat and Turkish bob. I began to sweat and dribble. The shop became a giddy plug hole of plastic price cards and a father and child asking if I'd finished with the laptop. I opened my mouth to answer, but words don't really form in a boiling geyser of pork. Ruby Fuss said, "Perfect." In a phone box 24 hours later, pale and shaking, I told Vone I had my piece on a disc. I've called it Debaucheries Calidase, and it takes the form from a scientific paper. Shall I bring it round? Vone explained that my piece had been reprioritised, since Ruby Fuss had come up with something similar, that not only mentioned sausages, but a guy writing about them on a shop computer, and then puking on a kid. Altogether a much better framing than mine. "That was me," I said. "Well, we don't want the same piece twice, but I was commissioned." "Grow up," he said. "I'm ripping you off." Then he asked me how I felt. Then he said he'd just decided to write a piece about the abuse of freelance writers, and could he use my story, since it would really illustrate the point. But I was sick about 10 times, I said. I could hear him already tapping on the keyboard. Then I could hear him ask me to send in my disc anyway, as a perfect verite example of the sort of work that was being ripped off. "I've got no money," I said. We agreed on a price of £10. The girl at reception had a message from Vone. "Look up," it said. I looked up. A camera went flash. "He says your photo will add genuine pathos," said the photographer, and I agree. Both articles appeared the next day. Both stated that 98% of street sausages contain lethal microbes and fly eggs, and mentioned in passing that Turkish Bob was a bastard. 4 days later he found me and pulped me with a griddle. I was in Susie's house looking for a cigarette. I knew I wasn't going to find one because she'd given up and hired a smoking agent to remove all tobacco products from the house every other day for a year. I had no cash, and to earn my keep I had to stay by the phone and answer it to take messages. She made me do it in a New York gay accent so her friends would ask questions. In between phone calls I thought about cigarettes. I thought about breaking off their filters and putting the ragged end in my mouth and sucking a flame into the leafy tube, inhaling very deeply and savouring the mild anoxic rush with caustic crumbs of tobacco stuck to my tongue and lips. I opened the window. There's an office block opposite Susie's flat. Its smokers skulk in the lane at the back. Sometimes the smoke drifts up and in through Susie's window. Today, there was only the smoke from next door's incinerator. They have 2 dogs and they burn their turds in it. In desperation, I phoned an ad into Loot. "Cigarette wanted," it said. "Please phone Susie's number." The phone rang as soon as I put it down. Susie. She wanted her Astrakhan coat delivered to her office on the South Bank. I need it for 6. I'm meeting a playwright. I knew what that meant. She has a soggy valve for writers. Oh, and could you change the sheets first? I wore the coat to make sure I didn't lose it. My arms are about a foot longer than Susie's. In the street, I paused by the smokers, standing downwind and about 2 yards away, breathing like a runner. I made good use of their fumes. They stared at me with some suspicion. I felt a little conversation would help. I don't work with you, I said. More stares, so I explained. No one answered the ad in loot. They shook their heads and went inside. 2 hours later, I attempted the same method outside the stage door of the National Theatre. There were only 2 smokers, and the river breeze ripped their smoke up and over my head. I leapt and gulped, breathing 6 times too fast, and reeled giddily into the road. A car screeched to a halt and blasted its horn. I froze in shock. It drew up to my legs and honked again. I remained confused. There was a shout from inside. Then slowly the car pushed me over. As I squirmed in the grit, trying to remember how to swear, I heard a brusque male voice. And on the basis of that, I'd say felling a pedestrian feels more exciting than shooting a cat with an airgun, but not as genuinely transgressive as coming in your mother's handbag. Susie's laugh coiled around the pronouncement, and she appeared, tugging at the end of my arm. "Stand up," she said, "and meet Gobi Jovler. He wrote that play that won the awards." I remember the critics had said that it was the most devastatingly accurate play that will ever be written about sex. "It's the most devastatingly accurate play that will ever be written about sex," said Susie. Jovler looked younger than I had imagined, and meaty in the face. He was dressed smart, felty brown, as if for a photo and a colour supplement, and barking at a nervous stick with a handbook. The stick wrote everything down, including the volley of insults levelled at him, and laughed through a sycophant's fringe. Jovler inspected the front of my head. "Is this the one that fancies you, de Suze?" He was clearly amused. Susie giggled. Jovler jabbed a few words at the stick. Something like, "Casting note, an underdog so ugly the audience is incapable of any sympathy, no matter what befalls him." And he turned to me and said, "You may follow at a discreet distance. I have a plan for you. Do you have a cigarette?" I wondered. "What sort of fart skull are you?" he sneered. "Was I not holding a lit cigarette in last month's GQ? Could I have one then, please? You can have a whole box if you tell me the name of my next play." His last play had been called Fuckers. "More Fuckers," I said. "Sadly, it is currently nameless, but if you do turn out to be right, you may find your scroungings in Harwich," and he lobbed the box into the river. Susie and Jovler led me by 20 yards along the promenade. With the stick, one gruff remark to the right. Twice they stopped and held hands, gazing at the roof of the theatre whilst Jovler's name swept across the light display. Once he bawled me out for blocking the view of his poster. When we reached the bridge, he insisted on repeating the stroll, because he had only been recognised by 5 people. "You said you only wanted 5, said Susie. "Yeah, but 3 of them recognised me from the telly," he snorted. And we traipsed back and forth 2 more times before he announced that he and Susie were going to get pissed in a limo. Jovler's driver slung us over the river. Jovler and Susie helped themselves to the car bar. Watching this, the stick's eyes bulged, and he reminded me of a featherless, anorexic owl I'd dreamt about in hospital. Jovler poured him a large, colourless one. "What do you do?" I whispered. "Neat gin," he replied, but Jovler had heard me. "Daniel is a scribe, cursed with the intelligence to know that he will never be a first-rate writer, and enough ambition to rot horribly in this knowledge until in 25 years he claims that he wrote all of my plays and shortly afterwards drinks himself to death." Daniel snivelled before Jovler cut him off with, "No time to laugh, fuckpen. Get it all down." Later, I found a note in my pocket that said, "I don't write his plays. It's the actors that do that." We toured London in great random sweeps. Jovler all the time extemporising on urban alienation in the sexually malfunctioning zeitgeist. Look, he'd say, look at them. Dual income 6 dildos. And once, if you're bored of London, you're bored of London fucking, and I'm bored of fucking London because I'm bored of London fucking. This last, the stick applauded, until he was slapped. By the time we reached Susie's flat, Jovler had pronounced himself ready for the final act. As he dragged her to the chamber, he called over his shoulder to the stick. Tell New York I'll be up for an hour. Susie wondered if Jovler might give me a few cigarettes so I could remain in a fug at the breakfast bar while they got torrid. No, he's part of the scene, he said. He leered at me like a randy bandit and waved a box of cigarettes under my nose. Fancy one? I did. Then you must witness the top. With that, he shoved Susie onto her 4-poster and started to savage her bodice. Stick sat me down on the floor. It's where they usually sit, he said, and wrote feverishly as he spoke. I glanced up to behold Jovler, now naked and kneeling before a slightly ripped-looking Susie. Gobble my stoppard, he ordered, and fell on her in such a way as to bring this about. As he pushed himself into her face, Jovler turned on me and said, "How does it feel to see the woman you love being plugged by me?" An unborn scream burst in my stomach and spread like cold mercury through my chest. I put my hands over my face but kept looking through my fingers. "Write that down," he panted to the stick. "Visibly destroyed but can't look away." Then he whipped Susie round so her forehead slapped the wall and declared, "Mr. Stoppard will be shortly entering his box." Hammering continued for ghastly minutes, until the mobile phone which Jovler had gaffer-taped to his buttock chirruped in manic arpeggio. He ripped it upwards, listened, and interrupted. "Not now, mammoth, I'm fucking." Then he beamed the hideous grin of the unreservedly successful and slapped Susie quite hard around the face to celebrate. Now I could turn away, and to the sounds of this dubious pleasure I began to ponder a vague tumescence of my own. Eventually, with a series of pathetic squeaks, the playwright emptied himself into the region of Susie's chest and armpit. She didn't seem to notice. By this stage she was mainly asleep. He lit a cigarette and ordered his amanuensis to read back his notes. "Good," he said frequently, and Pinter, before dropping the butt in my lap and pronouncing himself pleased with a decent first draft. Then he told the stick to leak the mammoth episode to the Sunday Times. "I'll deny it in my next interview," he said. "That's how it's done." "Leave now," he said to me, as the stick prodded me through to a large sofa where I dragged urgently on the soggy floor. Through the stripped pine I could hear Susie, awake now and softly sobbing, accompanied by the fart of his voice, which had taken on a new, almost pleading tone. "I hate the slapping too," he was saying. "It's just that, well, it really is the thing now, you know." 3 hours later he was gone, and I was asleep in the bed next to Susie. She'd called me in to cover the damp patch. I slept fitfully, tormented by febrile visions of a Jovler rampant, until Jovler's voice jolted me to. It was mumbling through the answer phone. "De Suze," it was saying. "You do love me, don't you?" "Yeah, I'm sure you do." "All right." "Yeah, all right. Good. I hope you're not too, you know, and, hey, it was, a voice behind him prompted something inaudible. "Yeah, it was a fuck supreme. You are the Marquis of Muff." There was a loud plunk, but the phone didn't ring off, and for some minutes I heard Jovler explaining to the stick that this last phrase would work at the National and would be quoted by 20% of the audience in the interval, and he would hear it, because he has a special window for listening. The mist had come in through the window, diffusing the grey light of no particular time of day. I was lying on the floor. I had been there long enough to stiffen. Some of the time I had been unconscious. The rest I had just been getting colder. It was my mother's house. I'd gone back to stay there. I do that when I'm at the bottom of a low, but I shouldn't. Particularly when the house is not actually my mother's, but just a derelict one that feels a bit like it. Towards the end, she had no windows either. This one also had broken doors and only some of its floors. I'd started this low by hanging around the bars of theme pubs, conspicuously dosing myself with Rohypnol and waiting for someone to drug rape me. I'd scored it on credit off a minicab driver who thought himself a successful rapist. He was foolish enough to trust me because of my accent. Of course, I had no real proof it was Rohypnol, but whatever it was wearing off now. And I was checking to see whether anyone had pleasured me in the last 24 hours, and then there was a knock on the main plank across the front door. I pushed my head through a broken pane in Mother's front sitting room. A young cyclist stared back at me with a smug grin and a silver envelope. "It's an invitation to Susie's wedding," he said. I told him she had a pretty odd way of accepting a proposal. He laughed one ha. I told him how Susie had kissed me and how shortly after I had proposed to her in a letter enclosed in a sea bass. She hadn't replied exactly, but she had thrown it into the sea, which perhaps was a posh way of saying yes. He looked dubious. "The posh do things differently," I said. He suggested that perhaps I open the envelope. Inside was an invitation in illegible copperplate, a red card in quilted silk with a pair of alloy lovebirds canoodling in the centre, and a handwritten note that read, "Come at once. I must talk to you at once. Susie X." Susie's house was a bustle of caviar and champagne, and about a dozen female strangers with familiar faces. She kissed me all over the place, gushed, "You know everyone, of course," and left me facing a wall. I stayed that way because it felt safe. I could hear her bustling around, busily issuing "we musts" and fetching congratulations. "We always knew it would be him," they said. "It's because she understands me," I thought. Susie's voice swept over my shoulder. "And you, my darling, will give me away." She squeezed me through my trousers. I turned towards the noise. She looked suddenly intense. "You know how much I love Daddy, and now he's dead. Well, I need someone special, and I wondered if perhaps it could be you." And then she added, "You are by far the oldest looking of my friends." She smiled again, and her eyes done a sexy. "So, are you marrying me?" I said. "Sort of. Shouldn't I have given you a ring?" She looked kinder now than a village baker lady and kissed me softly on the forehead. "You'll be standing right next to me," she said. "It's just standing up in front of people for a while." As she receded and I renewed my congress with the wall, the room around me hummed and crackled with talk of men. In particular, a man called William, and a broken memory surfaced like a puff of something half gone and awful. A crass, beaming face. Too much nodding. Susie laughing, nudging me and saying, "Sometimes you should laugh like William." And slowly, without knowing why, I began to feel about as sad as it is possible to feel while staring at a wall in a room full of women. 3 or 4 times in the next 6 months, Susie had me round for a feed. People were unusually nice to me, especially William, who, having materialised, looked older in the face than the memory, but still boomed at me excitedly and slapped my back whenever possible. Otherwise, life continued in the usual blur of frowns, doctors, lying down, and people saying, "Get the fuck out of my garden." And then suddenly we were all in a church surrounded by fields. I was stood next to Susie and William. Behind us, a stew of faces. At the altar were 2 priests, both in informal robes, like kimonos. Both were thin, and both, I learned later, had AIDS. Julius was gay. Crispin had an unlucky transfusion. Later still, I found that it wasn't unlucky at all. He'd deliberately taken on contaminated blood because he believed that underneath he was intrinsically a promiscuous homosexual and felt guilty that he'd never had the nerve to do anything about it. Both priests looked similar, but you could tell them apart because all the girls loved Julius. To begin with, Julius did most of the talking, almost chatting and smiling infrequently in our direction. I couldn't hear all the words above the drumming that generally bothers me on large occasions, but whenever he raised his voice I felt obliged to say, "Not bad thanks, how are you?" He smiled kindly when I did this. When Crispin took over, he turned his attention increasingly to Susie and William, and became more solemn and started holding their hands. At one point I heard him say, "Let him speak now, or forever hold his peace." There was a silence. Susie winked at me. William smiled, and a little git of panic broke onto my diaphragm. "Who gives this woman to this man?" said Crispin. Susie looked at me again. I looked at Crispin, at William, and a man next to him holding a ring, and I began to see with the clarity of cold gin where this one was going. I said nothing. "Who gives this woman to this man?" Crispin said again. I knew what I had to say, but the only way I could think of saying "I do" was to say "fucked if" first. I just stared back at them, trapping the response in my mouth so tight my lips ached. So Susie jabbed me in the cummerbund, which made me say "Waddy." It was good enough for them. They continued. I didn't want that. I made a longer noise. Crispin stopped. I made it again and slapped my face to add importance. He looks worried. "Is there a problem?" he whispered. The stained glass behind him, which included, at Susie's insistence, a panel featuring the Rolling Stones as 5 of the 12 apostles, began to rotate and was joined by the nave and transept. I heard my voice say, "Yes," and I agreed with it. His eyes widened. "I have a problem with this marriage," I blurted. "What?" said the priest. William's face flared a gale warning, and Susie looked appalled, but was unable to suppress a slight wiggle. "The problem," I seemed to be saying, "is William." At the back someone cheered. Relatives gasped in disbelief. William gave me a warning grunt, and I remembered everything. I remembered young versions of William and myself, and 4 others who escorted Susie. I remembered how people called us her brood, how she had always confided that of the 6, it was me whom she had genuinely earmarked for marriage. How sometime during all of this I had flown off the thread and had collapsed too far even to realise how far I had collapsed. So here I was, staring at William, the dullard, the dependable, whose moderate fortune now stood him proudly above all his time-debauched peers, and who most importantly of all would be too far loyal to suspect Susie's affairs. "What is your objection?" Crispin was saying. I pointed at William. "He is a tit," I said. Silence. 3 or 4 male laughs, immediately stifled by female glares. 1 female laugh, unrestrained. Objections. A priest whispering, "Fuck." Rough hands tight around my biceps, under my arms, my knees. Sudden jagged daylight, lying on my back, and 4 angry male faces, dark against the sun. One of them I recognised as William's brother, all of them ranting about smashing my head in. Then 3 girls joining in, saying, "No, no, he needs help," and eventually all of them compromised with beating me up with drugs. I remember nothing of the reception. Apparently I was swaddled in Egyptian cotton in a bedroom upstairs. Apparently William came up to say, "No hard feelings," and I tried to push him out of a window. Susie herself had told me later that her grandmother had paid me a kindly visit, and I told her how Susie and Imogen had once used bacon to make Granny's Doberman lick their vaginas.
When you fruit sack be boot sack, vam kick sharp and gob, while you wish satsuma. When hands be warm, but only dew, raging infect of the blood and the skin and the nail and the bone and the tissue bacteria, ooh la la rouge. Well, so look at you, screaming and shouting like an angry turnip. Ooh, fucked up ridiculum, most foolin' to Yesophen, and I have no sympathy, ooh, turnip. And when all your remaining joy hides unnoticed in one shriveled cell at the bog bottom of the very bum tube of East Joffy, then welcome. Oh, fudge, welcome. In blue jam. 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 Blue jam.